Stephanie, welcome to the Leaders Who Care series.
Hello, Mark. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I've been looking forward to this for a while because of all that you do. And I know we were just talking about Africa and all sorts of stuff. There's so much, but as we say in LA, we've got to leave them wanting a little bit at the end so we can do a sequel. So we'll do as much as we can get in here and go from there. Best place to start is if you can briefly introduce yourself. Women are much better at this than men. In fact, that's probably a general statement overall, but in the sense that men go right to their job to tell me about themselves. Without talking anything about business, tell us about Stephanie, where you're from, where you are, family, favorite color, something you've never told anybody ever you want to tell now, stuff like that.
Well, how you and I know one another is a dear friend, Scott Remus, who's a partner with you in Fifth Element. And fun fact, my family actually would say displaced Native peoples in Colorado back in 1887. So my family goes back 4 generations, and I'm here in Denver, Colorado, on land that was unceded by the Ute and several tribal nations. And my family ran away from their parents, and I was born in Port Angeles, Washington. And the drive was too far from Washington to Colorado. So halfway between was Idaho. So I actually grew up in Idaho.
That was well planned.
Summers in Colorado. And through a turn of really wild life events, both my mom and my dad passed at 56 and 58 years ago, 20 and 18 years ago. And during the pandemic, Scott actually helped me. I decided to put the oxygen mask on myself and bought kind of a forever home in downtown Denver. And turns out I purchased it, and then I called my mom's siblings, my uncles and aunts, or I emailed them, and I said, "Hey, where did you grow up?" And it turns out they grew up 8 minutes away from here without me knowing it.
Wow. 8 minutes. You probably saw them at some point.
Yeah, well, I mean, my mom was a kid here, and she passed 20 years. So it's just super wild that I feel like I guess what I will say is I'm a small town kid I grew up in Haley, Idaho, in the Sun Valley area. And I like to say one of the best qualities about growing up in a small town is you see the connections with everybody across difference. And I've just kept that with me in my 40s going into my 50s next year. And I just love that without knowing it, I buy a house 8 minutes from where my mom grew up 50 years ago, 60 years ago, 70 years ago.
Not by accident. And you love potatoes, right?
Yeah, I get asked that a lot. It was funny
I bet you did.
I went to school in Minnesota. I also ran away from my family, and I finally was one of my closest friends is named Sarah Faith Koski, now Sarah Koski Overland, who lives in Norway. And she and I was teased so much by the volleyball team. So I grew up playing a lot of sports and grew up in the sawtooths of Idaho. So I got to go camping a lot and loved camping, and was the starting quarterback on on the football teams until I was like in 7th grade.
Wow.
And so I used to be teased so much by my college volleyball team, and they'd say, "Oh, do you grow potatoes?" And finally I was like, "Yes, I grow potatoes. My family grows potatoes." I just whatever they asked me that was ridiculous. I was like, yes. And so Sarah and I meet, we connect. She comes as a first-year student. I was a first-year student. I said, "You should come by later and meet my college roommate." I've been used to telling tall tales so much that I met her earlier that day, and I said, "Hey, college roommate, meet Sarah." Funny thing is, Sarah and I actually met earlier this summer. I said for graduation, my dad sent me on a trip to Antarctica, and Sarah and I were the 33rd and 34th women to ever step on the continent. And Sarah looks at me and looks at my roommate at that time, and she says, "I would have been 33rd, but Steph pushed me out of the way." And we have remained very good friends, even across the ponds, as I said.
Well, yeah. And we never have enough really good friends on top of that. So I bet, I guess it shows Idaho's doing good marketing though, too, if everybody always remembers potatoes. So
Yeah, fair enough. Yes, we do love
um,
potatoes.
and I do love Minnesota as well.
Mm.
Because I lived in Winnipeg for a few years. I used to go down to Minnesota for hockey a lot, actually, and then some business later on. So, but you don't have a Minnesota accent, so
I can pull out my Minnesota accent if you want me to. I spilt some milk on my bag and ruined it. And my family actually goes back to Minnesota too. So my great aunt Jan is almost 92, and she said, "I'm so proud of you." And I said, "But I have a hard time explaining what you do for a living." And I just said that this summer. I said, "Great aunt Jan, I help people take their money out of Wall Street and invest it in good things on Main Street." And I happen to be working a lot with companies on Wall Street to teach them how they can take their resources and help people on Main Street too.
That's the way to do it. I love that. I love that description. Actually, I'll have to tell that I'm going to be seeing my almost 96-year-old aunt, second mom, in Montreal soon, and because I'm not sure she knows what I do either, sort of, kind of. But so that's another story. So, what were you like as a kid and a teenager? Were you outside in nature a lot? Were you organizing, entrepreneurial lemonade stands with kids? Playing sports, music? What were you doing?
Yeah, I would say sports led my life, and outdoors led my life, and music and was probably second. It wasn't until later in life I took a test called the Berkman test, and it said my number one aptitude was persuasion, and tied for second was music and service. And so I would end up getting into songwriting and ballroom dancing in my 40s because I took a test that told me I had an aptitude to it, and it turned out I deeply loved it. But as a little kid, I was definitely camping and playing all sorts of sports, and was captain of 3 sports in high school, and did 3 sports in college, and loved sports, and was an overachiever, salutatorian, and class secretary. And but there was a piece where my parents divorced, and my mom moved me from Boise up to the Sun Valley Wood River region in Haley, Idaho. And that was a really interesting time for me because I got exposed to experiential learning. I had this amazing 9th grade science teacher. And so instead of reading about weather or reading about science, we would actually go do it. And we would measure.
What a great idea.
And we would go backpacking, and we'd build a science trail or nature trail. And that was really amazing. And I was exposed back then to rip rafting, basically how we would channel rivers to for our roads and for us to live. And it's funny because I was 14, I'm 49 right now. And I'm really pulling back on those moments as a 14-year-old right now, because I would frame what I do now as I'm a restoration ecologist in the financial markets. And taking that mathematical ecology, but even those lessons as a 14-year-old on that field trip, learning about how we modify the flow of a river, and that really we have capital. And so and we have, say, the Colorado River, and it has these canals for our water and our lawns and our energy and all the things we need. And so we make these canals in the river, and just like that, we had canals of flows of capital. And pre-Wall Street, it was all on Main Street. And I think the canals are asset classes. And how do you heal a sick river? If you pull too much water out of the river, you restore the flow. And so a lot of what I do now and with financial innovation is really the same thinking that we're doing to heal our rivers by restoring the flow of the water to the rivers from the canals. And I restore the flow and holistically look at the capital in the financial markets.
Well, you just answered one of my next questions coming up, but that was lovely. It reminds me of when Jay Leno used to interview Robin Williams, and he said, "Robin, all I have to do is say, 'Hey, Robin,' and it goes from there." But that was beautiful, so I didn't want to stop you. Let's look at your journey a little bit. You took a bachelor's in wildlife management and biology, then a master's in ecology, and then a PhD in forestry in Wisconsin, Utah, and Montana. So you were an equal opportunity state play person or whatever.
Absolutely. Well said. A couple interesting things. And in Idaho, when I was growing up, they were reintroducing wolves into Yellowstone, and we still have our endangered salmon, the spring summer Chinook anadromous salmon that, are born in Idaho and swim all the way out through the Salmon River and Columbia River and to live in the ocean and come all the way back. And
which is quite amazing.
Yeah, it is. And what's also amazing is I have worked with and studied and researched and lived with and been neighbors with the river guides who depend on water flowing for their livelihoods, which are in conflict with the fish that need the water for their reproduction. And the same, I've lived and worked with and been neighbors with the ranchers who are in conflict with the wolves. And that conflict was very violent growing up. They would bring in armed guards, you would to protect the fisheries biologist or the wildlife biologist for this piece of it. And I had this deep knowingness that there were enough money, that there was enough resources for the river guides and the fish and for the ranchers and for the wolves. And that I just felt like there was like this false pitting us against each other. And so that's really, that idea has driven me for a long time. And I was deeply committed to service. My dad was an entrepreneur and did really well until a point that he suffered from depression and ended up becoming a millionaire who became homeless for a couple of years. And he, what's interesting about that is when I was 12, he offered me a business. My mom wouldn't let me do it. It was a precast concrete business. And then when I was 16 or 17, I announced, Dad, I'm going to become a carpenter. And he looked at me and he said, what? He said, architect. And I said, wildlife biologist. And he's like, seriously, you have a mind for business, go into business, make money and have influence. And what I knew back then is I wanted to be in my integrity. And I thought that meant that I had to be in the public sector. I said, no, I'm going to go be in the public sector. And my community argues around wildlife. That's where the debates were. So that's what led me on that journey. And I was, and over time, I realized, wait a minute, my passion isn't about the critters. It's about the resources where the critters and the humans are being, having conflicts against each other. And I was really fortunate. Most of us don't get to go work with our hero, our living hero. And the man who led the spotted owl project was Dr. Jack Ward Thomas, and he would become the first wildlife biologist to become chief of the Forest Service. And it's cute. Jack said before he passed, both he and my mom passed of pancreatic cancer. And he said, you do tell people I taught you everything I know. And while he winked at me and said that, I will say what he did for me in a powerful way is when I joined University of Montana, and he said, if you want to work with people, come up and work with me. And he said, you've already taken enough natural resource classes. So I haven't looked at my actual PhD in forestry. I might have 1, 2, 3 classes, but the rest are in communication, social science, and econ.
Oh, wow.
And I'm super grateful that he just had this knowingness that to solve the biggest problems of our time, we needed some people that were trained across disciplines. And I'm super grateful that he encouraged me to do that and kind of helped me lead the way to make that happen.
No, that's brilliant, brilliant advice. I know, we all learn from our experiences, not I usually make a differentiation between years of experience and actual experiences. And yours are quite fascinating. You've described some already, but like firefighter to editorial clerk, where you're fighting different types of fires, I guess, research and programs and conservation, sustainable development, and you name it. Quite incredible and probably super interesting. And what a foundation towards, which is what you're talking about, what you're doing now. Did you, and you possibly answered this a little bit, did you see it coming, or was it inevitable that was going to become your vision and your passion?
It makes complete sense now. It did not make any sense along the way. And I think, I sometimes call myself an academic entrepreneur. I said, I like doing research and teaching, and I love career coaching. Like, that is my favorite thing I love doing. And if I'm only doing that, I miss doing transactions. And if I'm only doing transactions for good, I miss doing teaching and research and this life career coaching. And part of the reason I love life and career coaching, and I have no regrets about this. Like, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing had I not had all those experiences. And well-intentioned leaders that coached me along the way, I think, said, oh my gosh, she reminds me of me. I'm going to encourage her to do what I did,
Right.
versus helping me figure out my path. And I think that's well-intentioned people, where they see mini me's and many. And so I think the for me, there was part of it was my dad was a millionaire and became homeless. And that kind of set me on a different financial pathway, where I had to defer my student loans and go in the Peace Corps, going to graduate school. And the advice I was getting at that time, I said, I want to go into policy. And they said, well, you have to become a really respected scientist first. And so scientists were giving me advice that I needed to become a really respected scientist. And so that's what kind of, I listened to them, admired them, respected them. And along the way, I realized, wait, this isn't my passion. And I want to shift gears. And also, when I started my PhD, I had an opportunity with my dad. The last 3.5 years of his life, he got a real estate license and a mortgage broker license. And all of a sudden, my former partner and I, we had 2 incomes plus a graduate stipend, which for us felt like we were wealthy beyond riches. And so every 6 months we would buy a house. My dad had an apartment downstairs, and he would get the real estate fee and the mortgage fee. And couple into probably 10 houses on house number 3, 4, or 5, my dad came home and he said, there's all these families with bad credit, but there's a slice of these families that they had good credit. They just didn't have medical insurance, and they had a medical event, and now they're 1, 2, 3 years away from buying a house or a car. And we had a family meeting and said, we think they're great credit risks. Why don't we buy the house? Why don't we lease option it to them and set aside part of their rent as partial equity? And if the house appreciates above 10%, we'll give them that upside. And the house is appreciated 15 to 25%. And we were just so grateful, because we got a job for my dad, the joy of philanthropy, great tenant, a 10% return. They got dignity, got to move into their home a couple of years early, get partial equity and upside. And that was, I've lost count, probably 800 transactions ago.
Holy cow, that's amazing. It's you're talking our language, as you probably know anyways. Where when we founded Fifth Element, it was based on that leaders in whatever they're doing can do way better when they're doing good. It's not fluffy, it's not fantasy, it's for real, for all sorts of reasons. And that's what you were doing there. And whether you want to call it the universe and the energy and the this and that, doesn't matter what you call it. It just is. Can you describe other experiences like you've had, or the experience of how those people felt that they gave them a shot, and the accomplishments you've had and the obstacles you've had along the way has given you the foundation we talked about, has given you the knowledge and expertise, but also the ability to identify the relationship with those people, like he did and you did, where they were good on paper, bad credit risks, but they were good risks. And then let's talk about how you use that to match impact and investors, so on and so forth. Let's start with that.
Yeah. Well, one thing I'll say is there's this idea that you should surround yourself with thought partners that are not echo chambers. And one of the greatest gifts of my life has been being in peer networks, and some of those were leadership networks. And the year was probably December of 2005. So almost 20 years ago, 18 years ago, when I was in a leadership network with this woman named Sonia Newenhouse. And my mom had passed 2 years earlier. My PhD was winding up. My dad had passed 2 months earlier, a month and a half earlier. And Sonia had been watching what I'd been doing with these transactions. And she called me, and she, out of love, said, I've made a decision. You need to switch your career into real estate. And I remember she's Danish, and I was like, hi, Sonia. And she's like, hi, Stephanie. And she basically said, you need to switch your career into real estate. And I said, well, you mean like real estate agent? She's like, I don't know what the answer is, but I made a second decision. You need to quit your job. That's the only way you'll have the courage, you'll find the like urgency, the courage, the
Right.
will to figure out that pathway. And I remember saying back to her, I'm a daughter of a single parent. I just don't up and quit a perfectly good job. But I really value and trust people who love me and see the world differently. And she's a rare human in that she's an extraordinary visionary, but she's also extraordinary at meticulous details and getting transactions done. And I listened to her, and I went part-time. I like found a happy medium, and I went 6 months part-time and shifted out of my awesome federal government job, which I'm so happy to be back working with the USDA with the Forest Service now, into finding where is the intersection of real estate and natural resources, and was really grateful to have landed a job in the real estate department of the Nature Conservancy in Colorado. And so that was a important shift. And I tell people now, it's not that my fear goes away. Like, I'm deeply cautious, fearful person. It's just that when you lose your parents in your 20s and you realize they're in their 50s, all of a sudden it just really clarified how I wanted to spend my life in alignment. And it also gave me a lot more courage to take risks. So it's not that I get up to the edge of the building and look over and I don't have fear. It's just that I keep jumping off the building and realize sometimes I skin my knee or maybe twist an ankle, but I've jumped off those buildings of fear along my career enough times now that I keep telling myself, jump and it'll be okay.
No, that's fantastic. What influencers too, that we'll talk about that in a little bit also, how influencers, make a big difference. How do you go a little bit further now? How have you come to the point where you're able to attract and match impact investors and next gen, what I would call next gen leaders who care, if you will, entrepreneurs, innovators, where just like you did with the people that were bad credit risk, give equal opportunities to achieve success?
Well, it's interesting. We were talking about sports earlier. I use a sports analogy when I talk about, you could call it an asset owner or a capital steward, essentially an individual, a foundation, a wealthy family office, a company, an endowment. And I talk about the farm team and from the Colorado Rockies down to T-ball. And I say, where are these people in terms of intelligence, access to capital, and mission alignment? And I'm like, they're major league, like they're rock stars. But for most people, even with resources, they have never written a $250,000 check to a intermediary, like a community financial development institution, to make a loan for affordable housing, or a $25,000 startup check. And so we pitch them all the time as if they're major league in experience, when in fact they're not even in T-ball. They haven't ever been invited to go to T-ball. Mm-hmm. And so asking them to write that first check is like asking you and me to go stand in the batter's box of the Colorado Rockies and start swinging at 95-mile-an-hour fast pitches without ever having learned how to hit a ball off of a tee. And so while people see us matchmaking investors, we spend most of our time providing T-ball and doing that heavy, slow education work. And where somebody comes to us and says, give me your top 3 problems, 1, 2, 3, and we help solve them. So we spend, for sure, 75% of our time identifying, educating, and activating individuals and organizations to become impact investors. And we use this concept called full spectrum capital, where we explicitly say expenses, including grants and any expense on a balance sheet, is an asset class with a negative 100% financial return. And so we've actually coached Walton Family Foundation to do a negative 50% return investment for $500,000 And then we make a case that that's an above market rate return of 50% to giving their money away. And what happens if you grow more and more investors and they do their third thing and their fifth thing and their 10th thing and 30th thing, you start to build an investor database. And then at that point, it makes sense to create farmers markets to connect investors to amazing, what we call social ventures, projects, nonprofits, small businesses, startups, and funds. And I will say, back in 2012, when the Jobs Act passed, it was this really profound moment in US history where Congress was like, wait a minute. Maybe we went too far by saying low middle income people cannot invest in their own backyard. We should let them invest. And I felt like it was kind of a gold rush. And most people, I was like, okay, you need two things to make a double-sided marketplace. You need three things to make a double-sided marketplace work. You need the fintech software that's in compliance with FINRA. You need the investors, and you need the social ventures. Now, there's been 40 impact plays like this, and now pre those crowdfunding platforms. And I was like, I think everybody's rushing over to build the platform. I think the more difficult thing to do is to become an investor accelerator and grow investors. And so I ended up choosing the kind of the road less traveled, and to say, could I actually identify, educate, and activate investors and grow individual investors, and then start to grow investor communities. And my thinking was, when the investor databases got big enough, then I could partner, buy, build, work with the fintech rock stars. And if you have the investors and the marketplace, then the social ventures will naturally come.
Yeah, it's brilliant. It's almost like, the fourth industrial revolution is about technology and AI and all that jazz. I stopped saying crap. Now I go to jazz. And the fifth is about humanity. And the big thread I love to hear when you're talking is about, you looked at the people that were bad credit risks, but they weren't. You're looking at the foundations and, educated them, for lack of a better word, about their negative return is better than the donation return, if you will.
Or expense. Yeah, but yes.
Yeah, well, there's options, or there's opportunities. And you also, we look for, when we represent leaders who care, which are the clients that we have that are looking for talent, we're looking at talent that is the right fit in that respect, that's not just looking for just money or just purpose. They're looking for both now, and won't accept one or the other. And so the humanity part, and the other part I see you have there, is you gaining trust by not putting that investor in the batting in up to bat right away. Also, they trust what you're doing.
I'm so glad you pointed that out, because part of the math and calculus was, when I became a finance professor at University of Colorado in 2010 to 12, I really took a step back, and I'm like, why is it so difficult to raise capital? And I realized 99% of the individuals, or 99% of the investor education classes, were being taught by somebody who wanted something from you.
Right.
And so there was a structural conflict of interest. Like, let me educate you, and then I become your investment advisor? Let me educate you, you invest in my fund. And I just remember thinking, oh my gosh, there's not a source of trustworthy, non-conflicted investor education that says, listen, pay a small fee for education, but this group is not going to try to move you anyway. We just want to, you have 100 million, you care about Colorado, climate, women and people of color. Let us help you, educate you, so you can help hire the right people who will give you advice, because we only give you education to make that so. So I think that's trustworthy education is where it's at. And one of my best friends, Nicole, she's a great granddaughter of R.J. Reynolds, and which is the aluminum and the tobacco family. And she's private, but has been willing to be a senior advisor and be public about her journey, because it's been so difficult. And she's been trying to do this for 25 plus years. And pre-pandemic, we're sitting in Austin waiting to present together. And we've done that dozens and dozens of times. And I look at her, I'm like, what was it about us that finally helped unlock your journey? And she was like, you didn't have a financial interest with me.
Right.
I could trust you.
Yeah, it's a terrible analogy, but it's like when when you have a high school sweetheart or somebody you like, and they're not interested in you, and then you make a ton of money, and all of a sudden they're interested in you, and it could be sincere, it might not be because you grew up, but why all of a sudden you have an interest in me? It's probably not a great aligned analogy, but it tells the story. Trust is so important. We've noticed that a million times over for everything. I work with someone that does heartful leaders, people that lead with their heart versus their brain, and everybody's craving that in the world for everything right now. They're craving that, just like just be with me type of deal, type of thing. So that's awesome what you do in that regard. Tell me something else. We were launched on International Women's Day when we launched Fifth Element back 5 years ago. You're a woman, obviously. What is it like? What has it been like being in everything from forestry, which could have been considered a man's job, to a firefighter, which definitely was a man's job. Although women look just as hot in uniforms as guys do. So that's cool too. Am I allowed to say that type of stuff on video? I don't know. But all
as
these
long as we don't share a kiss, I think you're okay. So
okay,
yeah.
cool. But it is more difficult, and it's a different experience being a woman in business, gaining trust, getting credibility, et cetera, et cetera. So how was it for you?
What is the quote by about Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers, that Ginger Rogers has to do everything Fred Astaire has to do, but she has to do it wearing high heels and backwards?
Right.
I mean, when you look at the people who are going to save us, it's Black women, women of color, Indigenous women, because they have it the hardest.
You bet.
And they know the most. And so a big part of what we have to do is, unpack that and go, okay, let's listen to them. And then you have white women, and then you have men of color, and from that perspective. And so I think that there's an interesting book by Malcolm Gladwell called Outliers. And if I remember correctly, there was a piece in the book that he compared geniuses and prodigies together. And he basically made the distinction. He said, prodigies grow up in really healthy families, healthy, safe situations. And there was a study, and I'm going to get the statistics wrong, but geniuses, there was a research project that looked at the number of people who lost a parent in their teens that found themselves in an encyclopedia. And it was a ridiculous percentage. I want to say 60% of the people in the encyclopedia had lost a parent in their teens. And so he talked about how geniuses actually grow up in adversity, and talked about this idea of near hit and near miss, about bombing in World War II in London, and how at one point the public officials were going to build tunnels underground, but they were worried that people would go underground and not come back up. And it turned out what they didn't anticipate is some people, if a bomb came by and hit the house next to them or the building next to them, they were like, oh my gosh, I made it. And they ended up gaining more courage and becoming more brave.
Because it's like a sign or whatever.
It's a near miss. And I think that's the equivalent for me of losing my parents in my 20s. I'm like, oh my gosh, life is short. Why am I playing it safe? So I would say, yes, it's been way more difficult. And it's really interesting to be midlife, in that I'm in some ways being more unapologetically brave about, if somebody does harass somebody else or myself, I will actually make a complaint, versus in my 20s and my 30s, I might be fearful of retaliation or this. And now I'm like, wait a minute. It's less even about, I look at it like it's my responsibility to clean this up and get that policy in place, so that the next 10 people behind me actually don't have to put up with that bullshit.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, and somebody's got to do, who was it that said, whether it's street kids or refugees or whatever, who knows how many Einsteins are among them, that we're losing, and there's lots of things like that, but that pretty well covers it too. Um, we're definitely gonna have to do a sequel, but I have one more question in this part.
Yeah.
And I love your analogies. That's right up my alley. A client told me once in 2021, he actually said, Mark, the year 2020, it was the year that flew by slowly. And I thought it was another great saying, basically. And to so many, it feels like 2020 was yesterday and years ago all at the same time.
Mm.
Scenario. And now we're already at almost the end of 2023. No kidding, these days time zooms. We don't use flies anymore, time zooms. And with all that said, and all the experiences you've had, what are you most grateful for? And what are you most hopeful for?
I love that question. The first year of the pandemic, our team was kind of like ER doctors raising. The first month we helped to raise 32 million for Colorado and outside in the pandemic. And then finally I was like, wait, this is a marathon, not a sprint. And we need to slow down. And there's the adage of, people say, put the oxygen mask on yourself first before you help out others. And there's this kind of like ethos in nonprofits and social justice of like, oh, you got to sacrifice is like a badge of honor. And that was the year for me where I was like, wait a minute, if I'm going to stay doing this, why am I not using that affordable housing program I created with my dad 20 plus years ago for myself and the rest of my team and the rest of my community? And so I was able to do that. And better to be lucky than good, and had friends show up and help me invest in this house that I'm standing in right now. And I have a carriage house behind it, and that carriage house is functionally making me semi-retired. And that is a game changer, right? It changed how I choose to spend my time, and even more alignment. It allowed me to take resources and actually invest in my health that I'd been putting off for 10 years. And so for me, the biggest shift for me and what I'm inspired is our organization I personally have put the oxygen mask on myself. Our organization has put the oxygen mask on ourselves. For the first time, we have we have runway, we have money in the bank, and we're getting to invest in long-term solutions and build assets. And my dream is to become the biggest donor to the backbone organizations. And we have some super exciting adventures along the way. We're going to roll out a shared due diligence platform for emerging managers that are raising funds at 10 million up to 500 million, starting with diverse, and expand out and split the due diligence cost. And we're looking at starting the first independent trust company focused on impact and investing.
Oh, cool.
And we put our nonprofit Impact Finance Center under the corporate foundation. And I'm also happy to report our dream was to create a academic center on the outside of a university, in which we have over 100 education modules recorded of our 200. And we're now being approached by multiple universities to create impact finance centers within them and then license them to other institutions. And so it's hard when you're doggy paddling to say like, okay, how do I put the oxygen mask on myself and my team first?
Right.
But that's the place that is giving me great hope. And I'd like to say I think and believe most of our team is being better taken care of. We're adding our retirement to our organization this year. And we're giving wages. I want to refinance debt. I want to get the rest of the team into home ownership if they want to do that. And we're doing that while being smarter, working smarter, not harder. And with an eye of like, we're going to earn or be given $20 million of assets so we can take those statewide farmers markets that we piloted in Colorado and expand them to all 50 states as a first step. And so I like to say part of having a healthy mind is that you are in alignment and you have agency and you feel like you know what you can do to make the world a better place, and you get to work with people you love doing work you love.
and you could be more creative and strategic and imagine, way more than if you're doggy paddling, as you said, all the time. So congratulations. I'm more hopeful just listening to you. So,
Yay, that makes me happy.
yeah, no, this is fantastic. Congrats on your journey, which is almost as critical as the result, if you will.
Absolutely.
And the future looks bright. I'm glad you're a leader who cares. So way to go.
Thank you, Mark.